World War II ended in 1945. Victory was declared against the Axis powers. The world hoped for peace after years of devastating war. But a new conflict emerged. This conflict was between the United States and the Soviet Union. It was called the Cold War. The US and USSR were allies during the war. They had a common enemy in Nazi Germany. But their alliance was one of convenience. Deep down, their ideologies clashed. The US championed capitalism and democracy. The USSR promoted communism and a totalitarian state. As the war ended, these differences became impossible to ignore. The USSR, led by Joseph Stalin, expanded its influence across Eastern Europe. This alarmed the US and its Western allies. They feared the spread of communism. The Cold War began, dividing the world into two armed camps. It was a war of ideologies, of suspicion, and of the constant threat of nuclear annihilation. At the heart of the Cold War was a fundamental clash of ideologies. The United States, a capitalist democracy, championed individual freedoms, free markets, and democratic elections. The Soviet Union, under the iron grip of Joseph Stalin, promoted communism, a system that advocated for a classless society, state control of resources, and a one-party system. The US believed in individual liberty. They valued the free market and believed in democratic principles. The Soviets, on the other hand, emphasized state control over most aspects of life. They saw capitalism as inherently exploitative. They believed in a centrally planned economy. These ideological differences shaped the Cold War. Each side viewed the other with suspicion and distrust. The US saw Soviet expansion as a threat to freedom and democracy. The Soviets viewed American policies as attempts to contain their influence and undermine their ideology. This fundamental ideological divide fueled decades of mistrust, propaganda, and proxy wars. The city of Berlin became a microcosm of the Cold War, a focal point where the ideological battle between East and West played out in stark relief. Located deep within Soviet-occupied East Germany, Berlin was itself divided into four sectors, each controlled by one of the Allied powers. The western part of the city was controlled by the US, Britain, and France, who sought to rebuild and democratize their sectors. The eastern part was under Soviet control, where the USSR aimed to establish a socialist state. In 1948, Stalin attempted to force the Western powers out of West Berlin by cutting off all access routes. He ordered a blockade of all land and water routes into the city, effectively isolating West Berlin from the outside world. The goal was to starve West Berlin into submission, hoping that the Western allies would abandon the city. This was a major test for the West, a challenge that would determine their resolve and commitment to defending democracy. Would they abandon Berlin or risk war with the Soviet Union? The stakes were incredibly high. The US and its allies chose a daring response: the Berlin Airlift, an unprecedented operation to supply the city by air. For over a year, planes landed around the clock in West Berlin, delivering food, fuel, and supplies to the besieged city, ensuring its survival. The airlift was a logistical marvel and a propaganda victory for the West, showcasing their ingenuity and determination. In 1949, Stalin was forced to lift the blockade, a significant defeat for the Soviet Union. The Berlin airlift solidified the division of the city and deepened the Cold War divide, setting the stage for decades of tension and conflict. In 1950, the Cold War turned hot on the Korean peninsula. After World War II, Korea was divided along the 38th parallel. The Communist North was backed by the Soviet Union. The Democratic South was supported by the United States. When North Korean troops crossed the 38th parallel and invaded South Korea, the US saw it as an act of Soviet aggression. President Truman committed American forces to defend South Korea. The UN also condemned the invasion and sent a multinational force. The Korean War was a brutal conflict. It raged for 3 years and resulted in millions of casualties. It also saw the first direct military confrontation between American and Chinese troops. The war ended in 1953 with an armistice. Korea remained divided, a stark reminder of the human cost of the Cold War. Section 5. The Shadow of Armageddon, the Nuclear Arms Race. The Cold War was defined by a terrifying new reality: the constant threat of nuclear war. This period saw the world's superpowers, the United States and the Soviet Union, locked in a tense standoff, each armed with weapons capable of unimaginable destruction. After the United States dropped atomic bombs on Hiroshima and Nagasaki in 1945, the world entered the atomic age. The devastating power of these bombs was a grim reminder of the potential for human annihilation. The Soviet Union quickly developed its own atomic bomb, igniting an arms race between the superpowers. This race was not just about military might, but also about technological and ideological supremacy. Both sides poured massive resources into building larger and more powerful nuclear arsenals. Factories worked around the clock, and entire economies were geared towards the production of these doomsday devices. The United States developed the hydrogen bomb, a weapon far more powerful than the atomic bomb. This new weapon could cause destruction on an even more catastrophic scale. The Soviets followed suit, creating a terrifying balance of terror. Each new development in nuclear technology was met with a counter-development by the other side. Each side possessed enough firepower to destroy the other many times over. This led to a precarious situation where any miscalculation could lead to mutual destruction. The nuclear arms race had a profound impact on global politics. Diplomatic relations were strained, and the world watched anxiously as the superpowers engaged in a high-stakes game of brinkmanship. It created a climate of fear and uncertainty. Civilians were constantly reminded of the potential for nuclear war through drills, public service announcements, and the ever-present threat of annihilation. The possibility of a nuclear holocaust hung over the world like a dark cloud. The doomsday clock, a symbolic representation of the world's proximity to catastrophe, was a constant reminder of the fragile peace. Both sides developed elaborate strategies to deter the other from launching a first strike. These strategies included early warning systems, second strike capabilities, and complex command and control structures. This doctrine of mutually assured destruction, or MAD, became a terrifying reality of the Cold War. It was a grim paradox where peace was maintained by the threat of total annihilation. Section 6. The Duck and Cover Generation. Life under the atomic cloud. The Cold War profoundly impacted American culture and society. The fear of nuclear attack permeated everyday life. The U.S. government launched civil defense initiatives. These included bomb shelters, air raid drills, and public service announcements. These announcements taught citizens how to duck and cover in the event of a nuclear explosion. Schools held regular duck and cover drills. Families built bomb shelters in their backyards. The threat of nuclear annihilation became a constant source of anxiety. It was a time of paranoia and suspicion. The government sought to root out suspected communists and Soviet sympathizers. This climate of fear had a lasting impact on American society. It fueled McCarthyism, a period of intense anti-communist paranoia. It also led to the creation of a vast national security apparatus. The Cold War shaped American politics, culture, and identity for decades to come. Section 7. Iron Curtain Realities: Life in the Soviet Sphere. In the Soviet Union and its satellite states in Eastern Europe, the Cold War had a very different impact. Life behind the Iron Curtain was shaped by communist ideology, state control, and constant suspicion of the West. The Soviet government controlled all aspects of life, from the media and education to the economy and personal freedoms. Dissent was not tolerated, and those who dared to criticize the government faced harsh consequences. Despite the hardships, there was also a sense of shared purpose and national pride in the Soviet Union. The Soviet people were taught that they were on the front lines of a global struggle against capitalist imperialism. They were encouraged to sacrifice for the good of the collective and to work towards the communist ideal of a classless society. Section 8. A World Held Hostage: Geopolitical Consequences. The Cold War had a profound impact on global politics. It divided the world into two opposing blocs, each led by a superpower with its own ideology and sphere of influence. This bipolar world order shaped international relations for decades. The Cold War also led to the formation of military alliances like NATO and the Warsaw Pact. These alliances further divided the world and heightened tensions. The superpowers engaged in proxy wars, supporting opposing sides in conflicts around the globe. The Cold War also fueled an arms race that consumed vast resources and left both sides armed with enough nuclear weapons to destroy the planet many times over. The threat of nuclear annihilation cast a long shadow over the world and shaped international diplomacy for decades. Section 9. A Legacy of Tension: The Cold War's Enduring Impact. The period between 1945 and 1960 marked the early years of the Cold War, a period of intense ideological struggle, geopolitical tension, and the ever-present threat of nuclear war. The world was divided into two major blocks, each led by a superpower. These years set the stage for decades of mistrust, proxy wars, and a global arms race that would define the latter half of the 20th century. The competition extended into space, science, and technology. While the Cold War eventually ended with the collapse of the Soviet Union in 1991, its legacy continues to shape the world today. The political landscape of many regions was irrevocably altered. From the ongoing tensions between the US and Russia to the proliferation of nuclear weapons, the Cold War's influence is undeniable. The echoes of the Cold War can still be felt in global politics and international relations. Nations continue to navigate a complex web of alliances and rivalries. The Cold War serves as a stark reminder of the dangers of ideological extremism, the importance of diplomacy, and the ever-present need to strive for peace and understanding in a complex and interconnected world. The lessons learned from this era continue to inform our approach to international relations today. A world divided, setting the stage for 1960 to 1975. This was a time when the world was split into two distinct spheres of influence, each vying for supremacy. The ideological battle lines were drawn, and the stakes were nothing short of global domination. The Cold War. It wasn't a war with guns and bombs, not exactly. It was a war of ideologies, a war of influence, and a war of propaganda. The United States and the Soviet Union were the main actors in this global drama, each trying to outdo the other in a myriad of ways. But it was a war nonetheless. Two superpowers, the United States and the Soviet Union, locked in a global struggle for dominance. This struggle permeated every aspect of life, from politics to culture, from science to sports. It was a battle for the hearts and minds of people around the world. Imagine a world split in two. On one side, the United States, championing democracy and capitalism. The American way of life was portrayed as the epitome of freedom and prosperity. Suburban homes, shiny cars, and the promise of the American dream were all part of the narrative. On the other, the USSR, promoting communism and a centrally controlled economy. The Soviet Union presented itself as the defender of the working class, a society where everyone was equal and the state provided for all. Grand parades, massive industrial projects, and the omnipresent symbols of communism were all part of their story. From 1960 to 1975, this rivalry reached new heights, marked by terrifying standoffs, devastating proxy wars, and a race to space. The Cuban Missile Crisis brought the world to the brink of nuclear war, while the Vietnam War became a bloody battleground for these competing ideologies. Meanwhile, the space race captured the imagination of millions, as both nations sought to prove their technological superiority. These years would test the nerves of both nations and shape the world for decades to come. The constant threat of nuclear annihilation loomed large, and every move was watched with bated breath. Espionage, military buildups, and diplomatic maneuvers were all part of the high-stakes game. The world held its breath. Every decision, every action, had the potential to tip the balance and plunge the world into chaos. Would it be a world consumed by nuclear fire, or would cooler heads prevail? The fear of a nuclear holocaust was ever present, and people around the world lived with the constant anxiety that the next day could be their last. The fate of humanity hung in the balance. The stakes couldn't have been higher. Political cartoons, military drills, and newspaper headlines all reflected the tension and uncertainty of the times. As the world watched, the two superpowers played a deadly game of chess, moving armies, spies, and weapons across the global board. Espionage became a crucial element of the Cold War, with both sides employing a vast network of spies and informants to gather intelligence and outmaneuver each other. The year 1960 began with an air of uncertainty. The world was still reeling from the aftermath of World War II, and the new geopolitical landscape was fraught with tension. The death of Stalin in 1953 had brought some hope of a thaw in relations. Many believed that the end of Stalin's brutal regime might lead to a more peaceful coexistence between East and West. But Nikita Khrushchev, the new Soviet leader, was equally determined to prove his country's might. His policies were a mix of de-Stalinization and aggressive posturing, and he was not afraid to challenge the West. The United States, under President Eisenhower and then Kennedy, remained committed to containing the spread of communism. The doctrine of containment shaped American foreign policy, leading to interventions in various parts of the world to prevent the spread of Soviet influence. This clash of ideologies set the stage for a turbulent period in history. The world was a battleground for competing visions of the future, and every conflict, every protest, was a reflection of this larger struggle. From Berlin to Vietnam, Korea to Cuba, the Cold War cast a long shadow. The construction of the Berlin Wall became a stark symbol of the divided world, while the Vietnam War and the Cuban Missile Crisis were flashpoints that brought the superpowers to the brink of direct conflict. The world watched, waited, and prayed for peace, all too aware that the next conflict could be the last. Peace rallies, prayer vigils, and nuclear disarmament protests were all part of the global response to the ever-present threat of war. The world was a powder keg, and the fuse had been lit. The actions of the superpowers would determine whether the world would be engulfed in flames or find a way to coexist in peace. Perhaps no event epitomized the terrifying stakes of the Cold War more than the Cuban Missile Crisis. This confrontation between the United States and the Soviet Union brought the world to the brink of nuclear annihilation, a scenario that seemed almost unthinkable just a few years earlier. The crisis unfolded over 13 intense days in October 1962, but its roots stretched back much further, into the deep-seated ideological and geopolitical rivalries of the Cold War era. In 1962, the world teetered on the brink of nuclear war. The stakes were incredibly high, and the potential for catastrophic consequences was on everyone's mind. The Cuban Missile Crisis was not just a regional conflict, it was a global showdown that had the potential to change the course of history forever. The Soviet Union, led by Premier Nikita Khrushchev, decided to place nuclear missiles in Cuba, a mere 90 miles from the US mainland. This bold move was intended to counteract the American missiles that had been placed in Turkey, which were within striking distance of the Soviet Union. Khrushchev's gamble was a high-stakes attempt to shift the balance of power in the Cold War. This was a direct threat, a move designed to challenge American dominance in the Western Hemisphere. The proximity of these missiles meant that major American cities were within striking distance, drastically reducing the warning time in the event of a launch. The American public, already on edge from years of Cold War tension, was thrown into a state of heightened anxiety. President John F. Kennedy was faced with an unimaginable decision. The young president, who had already faced numerous challenges in his short time in office, now had to navigate the most perilous crisis of his career. His options were limited, and each carried significant risks. A full-scale invasion of Cuba could trigger a nuclear response from the Soviets. Such an action would almost certainly lead to a devastating nuclear exchange, with unimaginable loss of life on both sides. The military buildup in Cuba was a clear and present danger, and the pressure on Kennedy was immense. Ignoring the missiles was unthinkable. Allowing the Soviet Union to maintain a nuclear presence so close to American shores would be seen as a sign of weakness, and could embolden further Soviet aggression. The threat of nuclear war loomed large, and the world watched anxiously as the crisis unfolded. The world watched with bated breath as American ships blockaded Cuba, preventing Soviet vessels from reaching the island. This naval blockade, termed a quarantine by the Kennedy administration, was a bold and risky move. It was designed to prevent further Soviet shipments of military equipment to Cuba and to force a diplomatic resolution to the crisis. For 13 long days and nights, the world held its breath, fearing the worst. Families gathered around their televisions and radios, anxiously awaiting updates. The tension was palpable, and the fear of nuclear war was a constant presence in the minds of people around the globe. Negotiations were tense, each side refusing to back down. The stakes were incredibly high, and neither the United States nor the Soviet Union wanted to appear weak. Diplomatic channels were working overtime, with messages being exchanged between Washington and Moscow in a desperate bid to find a peaceful resolution. Finally, a deal was struck. After days of intense negotiations, both sides reached an agreement that would defuse the crisis. The resolution required significant concessions from both parties, but it was a necessary compromise to avoid the unthinkable. The Soviets agreed to remove the missiles from Cuba in exchange for a U.S. promise not to invade the island. This public agreement was a significant victory for both sides, allowing them to save face while stepping back from the brink of war. The U.S. also secretly agreed to remove its own Jupiter missiles from Turkey, which were seen as a threat by the Soviets. This secret concession was a crucial part of the deal, though it would not be publicly acknowledged for many years. The Cuban Missile Crisis was a chilling reminder of the fragility of peace in the nuclear age. It underscored the dangers of brinkmanship and the catastrophic potential of nuclear weapons. The crisis had brought the world to the edge of disaster, and its resolution was a testament to the power of diplomacy and the importance of communication. It showed the world just how close we had come to annihilation. The images of potential nuclear devastation were seared into the collective consciousness, serving as a stark warning of the consequences of nuclear war. The crisis also highlighted the importance of communication and diplomacy. The establishment of a direct hotline between Washington and Moscow was a crucial step in preventing future misunderstandings and ensuring that leaders could communicate quickly and effectively in times of crisis. A direct hotline was established between Washington and Moscow to prevent future misunderstandings. This red phone became a symbol of the new era of communication and cooperation, a necessary tool in a world where the stakes were so high. The world had learned a valuable lesson, but the tensions of the Cold War were far from over. The Cuban Missile Crisis was a pivotal moment in history, a reminder of the ever-present threat of nuclear war and the importance of diplomacy in maintaining global peace. The lessons learned during those 13 days would shape international relations for decades to come, serving as a sobering reminder of the thin line between peace and destruction. While the Cuban Missile Crisis brought the world to the brink of nuclear war, it was a relatively short-lived confrontation. The Vietnam War, on the other hand, was a prolonged and grueling conflict that demonstrated the devastating costs of Cold War proxy wars. The Vietnam War was a stark reminder of how ideological battles between superpowers could lead to immense human suffering and geopolitical instability. Vietnam, a country divided by ideology, became a battleground for superpower interests. The North, backed by the Soviet Union and China, sought to unify the country under a communist regime. Meanwhile, the South, supported by the United States and its allies, aimed to establish a non-communist state. The United States, fearing the domino theory, the idea that communism would spread if one country fell, increased its military presence in South Vietnam, supporting the government against the communist North Vietnamese and Viet Cong forces. This fear was rooted in the belief that the fall of Vietnam to communism would trigger a chain reaction, leading to the spread of communism throughout Southeast Asia and beyond. What began as a limited intervention escalated into a full-blown war. The U.S. military presence grew exponentially, with hundreds of thousands of American troops deployed to Vietnam. The conflict became increasingly complex and brutal, with both sides committing significant resources and manpower. American soldiers found themselves fighting a determined enemy in unfamiliar jungle terrain. The dense forests and swamps of Vietnam provided the perfect cover for guerrilla warfare, making it difficult for U.S. forces to gain a decisive advantage. The Viet Cong and North Vietnamese army used hit-and-run tactics, booby traps, and underground tunnels to their advantage. The conflict dragged on for years, claiming the lives of millions of Vietnamese civilians and over 58,000 American soldiers. The war's toll on human life was staggering, with countless families torn apart and entire communities devastated. The psychological impact on soldiers and civilians alike was profound, leaving scars that would last a lifetime. The Vietnam War was deeply unpopular in the United States. As the war dragged on with no clear end in sight, public opinion turned increasingly against it. The anti-war movement gained momentum, with protests erupting across the country. Protests erupted across the country, fueled by images of the war's brutality and a growing sense that the conflict was unwinnable. The media played a crucial role in shaping public perception, with graphic coverage of the war's horrors reaching American living rooms. The stark contrast between official government statements and the reality on the ground further fueled dissent. The war divided American society, creating deep rifts between those who supported it and those who opposed it. Families, communities, and political groups were torn apart by differing views on the war. The conflict became a symbol of broader societal tensions, reflecting the generational, cultural, and political divides of the era. Finally, in 1973, a peace agreement was signed. The Paris Peace Accords marked the beginning of the end of U.S. involvement in Vietnam. The agreement called for a ceasefire, the withdrawal of American troops, and the return of prisoners of war. However, it did not bring an immediate end to the conflict. the United States withdrew its troops, leaving South Vietnam to fend for itself. The withdrawal marked a significant turning point, but it also left the South Vietnamese government vulnerable to continued attacks from the north. 2 years later, the North Vietnamese captured Saigon, effectively ending the war and reunifying the country under communist rule. The fall of Saigon was a dramatic and chaotic event, symbolizing the ultimate failure of U.S. efforts in Vietnam. The war left a lasting legacy, shaping U.S. foreign policy and military strategy for decades to come. The Cold War, a term coined by George Orwell, defined the global order from the end of World War II until the early 90s. This prolonged period of tension and rivalry shaped international relations and influenced countless aspects of daily life around the world. It was a period of intense geopolitical tension between the United States and the Soviet Union and their respective allies. Both sides were constantly on edge, preparing for the possibility of a direct confrontation. Despite never engaging in direct military conflict, the two superpowers were locked in a struggle for ideological dominance, military superiority, and global influence. This rivalry was evident in the arms race, space race, and various forms of cultural competition. The years leading up to 1975 were marked by intense confrontations, like the Cuban Missile Crisis of 1962. This event brought the world to the brink of nuclear war, highlighting the dangerous stakes of the Cold War. The world watched in fear as the two superpowers came perilously close to nuclear war. The crisis was a stark reminder of the potential for global catastrophe. There were also moments of cooperation, as seen in the signing of the Nuclear Test Ban Treaty in 1963. This treaty was a significant step towards reducing the risk of nuclear conflict, and showed that diplomacy could prevail even in the darkest times. Both sides engaged in proxy wars, supporting different sides in conflicts across the globe, from Korea and Vietnam to Angola and Nicaragua. These wars were battlegrounds for the larger ideological struggle between capitalism and communism. The Cold War was not just a military and political struggle, but also an ideological battle between capitalism and communism. This ideological conflict permeated every aspect of life, influencing culture, economics, and even the social fabric of nations involved. In 1975, a glimmer of hope emerged from the Cold War rivalry. The Helsinki Accords, signed by 35 nations including the United States and the Soviet Union, represented a significant step towards détente. These accords, signed in Helsinki, Finland, covered political, economic, and human rights issues. The Helsinki Accords recognized the inviolability of post-World War II borders in Europe, a key Soviet demand. In return, the Soviet Union agreed to respect human rights and fundamental freedoms. This was seen as a victory for the West, particularly for human rights activists within the Eastern Bloc. The Helsinki Final Act, while not legally binding, carried significant moral and political weight. It established a framework for dialogue and cooperation between East and West. The accords also encouraged greater economic and cultural exchanges between the two blocs. The hope for a lasting détente proved short-lived, as the geopolitical landscape began to shift dramatically. By the late 1970s, tensions between the superpowers began to rise again, fueled by mutual distrust and competing ideologies. The Soviet Union continued to build up its military, deploying SS-20 intermediate-range ballistic missiles that threatened Western Europe, causing alarm among NATO allies. The US viewed this as a provocation and a violation of the spirit of détente, leading to increased political and military tensions. In 1979, the Soviet Union invaded Afghanistan, intervening in a civil war in support of a communist government, which further escalated the conflict. This action sent shockwaves through the international community and was widely condemned in the West, leading to a series of diplomatic and economic repercussions. The United States, under President Jimmy Carter, responded with sanctions, including an embargo on grain exports to the Soviet Union and a boycott of the 1980 Summer Olympics in Moscow, signaling a hardening stance. The Soviet invasion of Afghanistan marked a turning point in the Cold War, shattering the illusion of détente and reigniting fears of Soviet expansionism. The United States viewed the Soviet intervention as a sign of its expansionist ambitions, prompting a re-evaluation of its own strategic priorities. The war in Afghanistan also had significant consequences for the Soviet Union, draining resources and exposing the limitations of Soviet military power, ultimately contributing to its eventual decline. The election of Ronald Reagan as President of the United States in 1980 marked a significant shift in the Cold War. Reagan, a staunch anti-communist, took a much more confrontational stance towards the Soviet Union. He famously labeled the Soviet Union an evil empire and made it clear that he would no longer tolerate its behavior. Reagan embarked on a massive military buildup, increasing defense spending and modernizing the U.S. nuclear arsenal. He also championed the Strategic Defense Initiative, or SDI, aimed at developing a space-based missile defense system. Despite skepticism and alarm, Reagan pressed ahead with SDI, believing it would give the United States a decisive strategic advantage. SDI also served Reagan's broader goal of putting pressure on the Soviet economy. Section 5. Winds of Change from the East. Gorbachev's Reforms. In the mid-1980s, a new leader emerged in the Soviet Union, Mikhail Gorbachev. Gorbachev, a relatively young and dynamic figure, recognized the need for change. He inherited a stagnant economy, a demoralized population, and a costly war in Afghanistan. Gorbachev introduced a series of reforms aimed at revitalizing the Soviet system. He launched Perestroika, a program of economic restructuring designed to introduce elements of market mechanisms into the centrally planned Soviet economy. He also initiated Glasnost, a policy of openness and transparency that encouraged greater freedom of expression and reduced censorship. Gorbachev's reforms were met with a mixed response. Many within the Soviet Union, particularly within the Communist Party, resisted change. In the West, Gorbachev's reforms were met with cautious optimism. President Reagan eventually warmed to Gorbachev and engaged with him in a series of summits that led to significant arms control agreements. Section 6. A hammer blow to the Iron Curtain, the fall of the Berlin Wall. On November 9, 1989, the world watched in astonishment as the Berlin Wall, a potent symbol of Cold War division, crumbled. This momentous event was a direct consequence of the changes sweeping across Eastern Europe and the Soviet Union. The Berlin Wall, erected in 1961 to stem the flow of East Germans fleeing to the West, had become a physical manifestation of the ideological Iron Curtain. Its fall was a powerful symbol of the erosion of Soviet power and the yearning for freedom. Protests against communist rule, fueled by economic hardship and a desire for greater freedom, had been growing across Eastern Europe throughout 1989. In Poland, the Solidarity movement forced the communist government to allow free elections, resulting in a victory for Solidarity. In Hungary, the government opened its border with Austria, allowing East Germans to escape to the West. Section 7. The Soviet Union crumbles, internal conflicts and economic stagnation. While the Berlin Wall's demise symbolized the waning of Soviet influence in Eastern Europe, the Soviet Union itself grappled with internal challenges. Gorbachev's reforms, intended to revitalize the Soviet system, inadvertently unleashed long-suppressed nationalist sentiments and exacerbated economic woes. The Soviet Union, composed of 15 republics with diverse cultures and histories, had long been held together by the iron grip of the Communist Party. Gorbachev's policies of Glasnost and Perestroika weakened the central authority that held this complex structure together. As censorship eased, long-suppressed grievances over economic inequality, ethnic tensions, and historical injustices resurfaced. The Baltic republics of Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania spearheaded the movement for independence. Adding fuel to the fire was the disastrous state of the Soviet economy, with decades of central planning leaving it in shambles. Section 8. The Final Act. The dissolution of the Soviet Union in 1991. The year 1991 marked the final chapter in the tumultuous history of the Soviet Union. It was a year of dramatic change and unprecedented events that reshaped the global political landscape. Despite Gorbachev's efforts to hold the crumbling empire together, the forces of nationalism, economic turmoil, and political upheaval proved too powerful. His policies of Glasnost and Perestroika, aimed at reforming the system, inadvertently hastened its collapse. By December of that year, the once mighty superpower had ceased to exist, dissolving into 15 independent states. Each republic sought to forge its own path, free from the centralized control of Moscow. The August coup, a desperate attempt by hardline communists to seize power from Gorbachev, proved to be the death knell of the Soviet Union. The coup's failure exposed the deep fractures within the Communist Party and the Soviet state. the coup backfired spectacularly, galvanizing popular opposition and accelerating the disintegration of the Soviet state. Mass protests erupted across the country, signaling the people's desire for change. While the coup failed to unseat Gorbachev, it fatally undermined his authority and emboldened Boris Yeltsin. Yeltsin emerged as a key figure, championing the cause of Russian sovereignty. One by one, the Soviet republics declared their independence, with Ukraine voting overwhelmingly for independence in a December 1991 referendum. This marked a significant turning point in the dissolution process. On December 25, 1991, Gorbachev resigned as president of the Soviet Union, declaring the office extinct. The Soviet flag was lowered for the last time, symbolizing the end of an era and the birth of a new geopolitical reality. Section 9. The Legacy of the Cold War. The Cold War, a conflict that shaped the latter half of the 20th century, cast a long shadow over global affairs, even after its conclusion. The end of the Cold War ushered in a new era of globalization, characterized by increased economic interdependence and technological advancements. With the collapse of the Soviet Union, the United States emerged as the sole superpower. However, the post-Cold War world has not been without its challenges. The collapse of the Soviet Union created power vacuums in Eastern Europe and Central Asia, leading to ethnic conflicts and civil wars. The proliferation of nuclear weapons and other weapons of mass destruction remains a grave concern. The Cold War also left an indelible mark on domestic politics in both the United States and the former Soviet Union.
Meine Arbeit für richtig hältst, ob du glaubst, dass ich fleißig gewesen bin, dass ich gearbeitet habe, dass ich mich in diesen Jahren für dich eingesetzt habe, dass ich anständig